Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast. Yo, what up, what up, what up?
What's up, Daph?
What's up with you, Terrell?
You know, it's been a good past weekend. I know Daph saw the news. I'm sure some of our listeners saw it, but not all of them. Recently, I found out this past Friday that I have been awarded tenure and promotion.
Wow. What a music at? What a music. We need some music to celebrate this.
That I know I should have queued up some music this time. I'm slacking. I didn't even think about it. But yeah, that was the good news. And of course, it was my first Father's Day weekend on Sunday. So a lot of good celebrating happening this past weekend for a lot of good news and just good vibes overall. So that felt good. But that was a huge weight off my shoulder when the mail woman came to my door on Friday. She usually doesn't knock, she usually just leaves a nail, but she knocked and she said, "Oh, I have certified mail. So you have to sign for it." I was like, "Oh, okay." And I saw it was from New Paltz. I was like, "Oh, here's the moment." And then I quickly opened it and read it. And in the first sentence and paragraph, it said that, "Congratulations." You were like, "Yes." And it was just me and Maya in the house at the time. So I told Maya, and she just gave me a little head nod and wave and kept crawling. So that was, at least she acknowledged it.
Yay.
But yeah, that was my weekend.
How did you feel? How did you celebrate?
What'd you say?
I said, how did you feel and how did you celebrate?
Oh, I felt good. It's kind of a moment where it took a little bit to sink in, I guess, because we worked towards that for so long in the academy. So I was really wow, did this really happen? And probably the next day is when it really hit me, oh wow, I'm really tenured and promoted. Because we work from grad school, and then grad school people do postdocs. It's a tenure track, and so it's actually a really long process. So you finally get to that moment, it's oh wow, it really is there. And I'm sure to feel that way a little bit more as time moves on and I actually start teaching again, and it just have a little different vibe when I'm back in the workspace. But yeah, so I've celebrated. I kind of went off my diet a little bit, had some ice cream cake, and had some pizza.
Nice.
To celebrate I was 5 again, like a kid's party. But that's what I wanted at the time, because it's been a minute since I've been trying to eat healthy, and and then also had some spirits, some bourbon to celebrate as well. So it was feel good. And the weather was nice. Went for a walk and all that kind of good stuff, and so I enjoyed that.
No. How many tenured Black professors are at your university? Do you know?
That's a good question. Not many, to be honest. I can probably only think of about 2 to 3 that I know of. It's not that many Black professors, period. And most of them that I do know, we are all junior faculty and came in after I did. So yeah, I might actually look at those numbers. I'm on the Diversity and Equity Inclusion Council on my for the College of Liberal Arts, so I can probably ask someone to pull those numbers for me. But that's a good question. I'm gonna try to find that out.
Yeah, well, this is huge. Congratulations. I've known you since graduate school. So to see you go from, fellow graduate student to tenured professor, it's amazing to have been on this journey with you. So celebrate you.
Thank you. And like I said to you on Twitter and to other folks, it's been good to have all this kind of support throughout the journey, and people support in different ways, but just the, friendship, the company, the labs, the podcast, all that kind of stuff has always been a solid form of support. That stuff, especially at Purdue, getting through graduate school, those things are what was needed to survive it, outside of just doing the academic work. That social life really helped get me through. So I always give folks, credence for that, because I think it was an important part of my journey, to say the least. So
Yeah.
So I'm glad you were part of that journey too, Jeff. And I'm part of your journey as we all see each other succeed and move to those next steps.
Yes,
So it's been
yes.
fun. It's been fun. You getting
Folks.
to pen, and then me getting the step. We're moving right along.
I was going to say, folks, one thing you can learn from Terrell is the importance of work-life balance, because he gonna balance that life. And, to see him succeed while doing so, it's like, come on, y'all, we can live a little, as well as make an impact on our university and the world more broadly. So kudos to you.
Appreciate that. How's your week been? I know you've been busy on the move, trying to look for an apartment and all that kind of stuff. So how's that been?
Yes. So I am currently in Philadelphia looking. As soon as we think we find a place, I read the reviews and I'd be like, nah, never mind. I don't know if it's a city thing. But yeah, everything I keep reading is like mice infestation. And I'm like, John, are you willing to have a cat or something? And he'll be like, no. And I'm like, well, this apartment is off of our list, because I cannot do it. Although I'm starting to believe that it's just something I might have to deal with. Like, it just might be a feature of big city life. I don't know, but it's just scary to think about. But also, of course, we're in the process of finishing up our book, guys. So busy doing that. And just trying to live life and have fun. We went to St. Louis. And so, it's funny, any given day I'll wake up, I'll work on the chapter. Then I'll hang out with friends and family, come back, home, or come back to the hotel, try to do a little bit more work. So I've been trying to live that balanced life as well and make progress.
No, that's important. That's important. That's how you survive. And especially it's the summertime. I mean, like, so we're getting out of the pandemic. So definitely spending time with loved ones and friends and family is, I think, even more important. I mean, it's always been important, but I think we value it a little bit more than we probably did in the past, because it was kind of taken from us in this past year. So prioritizing that is definitely a need. It should be happening. So kudos for you for doing that. That's good though. Hopefully you find a place that is not infested with mice, because that is never going to be fun. I know we talked about that before. Especially if you're like trying to move, when you move into somewhere new, you want to be like that new feel. I'm like, okay, let's fix it up and let's get comfortable. But right off the bat, if you're coming in with this anxiety of there being mice, that's just that's not the vibe you want when you enter a new space. So yeah, hopefully it's not. I mean, I've never lived in Philly or in surrounding areas. I haven't heard of that being a problem. Maybe I'll ask a couple of my friends who I know who have lived there and see if it is an issue or not. But yeah, those reviews are important, because me and Kristen did the same thing. Actually, one of our first apartments we lived when we moved to Jersey was a brand new apartment, but they didn't have a mice issue. But it was just like they lied to us about how thin those walls were. And so people be having all kind of music playing and people would be thumping. We weren't on the top floor. It was just like, nah, we moved as soon as possible. And the management wasn't good. So we left a really extensive review. And a lot of people did, who were like the first to live there. And they tried to actually go on the comments and say we was lying, all this kind of stuff. Like, what? Like, really try to cover it up. I'm like, no, this is the truth. And so I'm letting anybody know who moves here. Like, so I think, yeah, folks are going to be honest in those reviews. So, especially if you got mice, that's nothing to lie about.
Yeah. And the thing that gets me is like, okay, if it was one or two people, I'm like, okay, maybe. But just about I'm just like, at what point do we stop saying like, or stop believing that is, everybody's lying?
And maybe what you could do if you go to find a place and you go visit, maybe ask folks around. I don't know, that maybe that'll help. If there are folks like out and about that look friendly, you want to ask them, say, hey, we're thinking about moving here. You tell us what it's like. See what they say. But yeah, Well, good luck to you as y'all continue that journey because it's an important one. But hopefully, you find something soon.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Okay, so let's get to some Oh Lord news real quick, and then talk about today's special guest.
Hello, and welcome to BHD News, where we give you the most current and eye-opening Oh Lord news of the week. Join us as we present news that'll make you want to say,
Okay, so you've heard of Jonah and the whale, the biblical story, right? Well, we just had a 2021 version because Michael Packard, a Cape Cod lobster diver, was swallowed whole by a whale and then spit out alive. Yeah, it was crazy. So it was a mistake. And I actually, after I read this story, realized that this isn't actually the first time it has happened. Sometimes as whales, I guess are swimming, if their mouths are open, like divers and swimmers can kind of get caught up in there, but it's usually not on purpose. So often they're just spit right back out. That's crazy, huh?
These whales get a taste of that human, like, ew.
No, give me the fish.
Yeah, I saw this story a couple weeks ago and it resurfaced. I was looking into it. A couple experts questioned the story, health experts, I think because of his injuries. They're saying he would have had different, I think he just had a broken leg, I believe, or something like that.
Okay.
And so they were throwing that in the question, like, yeah, if this were to actually happen, we would see different type of injuries, especially more upper body injuries, etc. So he says it's true and is being held by that. No one else was there but him, so we don't know for sure. But some people are questioning it.
Yeah, that is funny. Speaking of questions, I have one for the World Health Organization because they just came out with a crazy suggestion for women in one of their latest reports. Want to know what they said?
Yeah, what is this?
They suggested that women from the ages of 18 to 50 be strongly discouraged or not allowed to drink alcohol because they are of childbearing age.
Oh boy, who will be sitting on these boardrooms making these decisions, man?
It's like that's in the 21st century where lots of women actually decide not to have children at all. That's very sexist and dated advice.
Yeah, it's like why? First off, it comes to the assumption that every woman expects to or wants to have a child, which is not the case. And so, what does that have to do with alcohol? Because your childbearing years, we understand that you shouldn't be, taking shots while pregnant. But if you're not pregnant or not looking to be pregnant, there's no issue. I don't even know why they put that suggestion or that recommendation out there because it's just silly. Yeah, that's weird. That's just a good question. I don't know why they did that.
Yeah, I don't either, but they faced a lot of backlash in the past week because of those recommendations. Okay. Well, for this last story I have, we've talked about the issues related to summer travel. I even was on ABC News last week because of all the, rising prices and rental car shortages. Well, guess what? There's a new shortage.
Uh-oh.
Pilots. Yes. Over the past weekend, American Airlines had to cancel 303 flights. And 3,000 more could be cut in July after pilots were fired at the start of the pandemic and not enough have been rehired.
Wow. That's crazy. And especially because I think I'm supposed to be flying American Airlines in October. So that's something to look out for because we're supposed to go to a wedding and stuff. So yeah, that's wild. So they fire everyone and now they haven't hired everyone back and now they don't have enough pilots to drive their planes or fly their planes. And now you're gonna have a lot of upset customers. That doesn't seem like a smart business move. I don't know. This is why companies, I know they have a lot of money. They need to retain some to keep paying their employees for things like this, especially your pilots. I mean, come on now. That's important. So I wonder if other airlines are experiencing the same thing, but another shortage, huh? This is not good.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where we know airlines were able to get government bailouts and government help, but they were still firing people. It's crazy.
So pilots though, like they're firing pirates. I mean, not pirates, pilots. Pilots. Man. But yeah, that doesn't make the most sense to me because that's one of the most important aspects to a plane. So. And I'm sure during that time period, a lot of those pilots probably found other planes or other airlines that were still, looking and getting hired because I'm sure they needed to eat. And this is probably why they're having a hard time because, hey, they're like, oh, no, we comfortable now. We here. So we ain't coming back. So not a good business strategy by American Airlines. So hopefully that my flight doesn't get canceled, but they have a contingency plan in case.
Yeah. Well, that contingency plan might not be Southwest Airlines because they also, I think for the last 3 or 4 days, have had to delay and cancel flights because of some computer issue, like technical issues. So these airlines are struggling.
Don't tell me, Dad, you push me in the direction United. It's my worst nightmare.
Oh my goodness, United. No, I cannot. Try to get Delta.
I'm gonna have to look. I'm have to try to look for Delta because United. I mean, that's the hub out here in Newark, so in Jersey. But I still always try to avoid them when possible. That's why I said I was flying American Airlines. But United is by far the worst. Okay. Yes. All right, I got a couple quick stories. One, I think it's just worth mentioning, which is funny because last week's episode, for our listeners, we talked about Juneteenth and it potentially taking a while to become a holiday. And of course, long and behold, they was like, nah, all of a sudden out of nowhere, the Senate passed almost unanimously. I mean, outside of maybe a handful of senators in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And then the House passed as well, and Juneteenth became a federal holiday during the week before. And part of me think like they did this because they just wanted the day off. So it's like an extra vacation day, which we found is weird. But yes, generally it does take a long time. And social media, I saw a lot of folks saying that they question like what's going on here. They say we can't teach it in schools, but yet we'll make it a federal holiday. So a lot of activists and just Black folk in general did find it skeptical, but then others celebrated it as well for them recognizing it, which is important. But for it to happen so fast, I gotta say it did raise raise my eyebrows a little bit. Like, what the heck is going on here?
Well, people have also been like calling out passing this Juneteenth legislation while at the same time fighting so hard to prevent students from being able to learn the truth about our history, which includes why Juneteenth is even a holiday to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's like we don't want to talk about it in schools, but when the holiday comes up, you don't expect educators to tell the kids what it's about. So I don't know. We'll see, but it is now an official federal holiday. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, not everyone is trying to honor that. And as mentioned earlier, a lot of Georgia legislators and politicians were the ones who didn't support it. And so Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, blocks making Juneteenth a paid holiday for state employees. So again, not everyone is supported it. Now, again, before that, about 24 states or so had already implemented things. I think this is part of the reason why the government passed it so fast. And I think 40 states were close to recognizing it or has some kind of recognition of it. So that's why it made it probably easier passage up there in Congress. But, not everyone. So folks in Georgia will not be getting paid leave or paid holiday leave for that, which is sad.
Yeah.
So hopefully when he gets out of there and maybe somebody else gets in there, like a Stacey Abrams or whoever, I'm sure they will fix that very quickly.
Hopefully.
Another quick story is that I saw this article from NASA. And they're talking about, again, I try not to say or talk about, not talk about it, but think a lot about climate change because it is a really worrisome thing. And they just the study found that the Earth has an energy imbalance and that the amount of heat the Earth absorbs versus the amount it releases has doubled since 2005. And they said this magnitude of increase is unprecedented. The scientist Gregory Johnson said this energy increase is equivalent to 4 detonations per second of the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, or every person on Earth using 20 electric tea kettles at once. They said 90% of the heat is being captured and trapped inside the Earth's oceans first. And so the Earth's temperature of sea surface has risen 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the start of the 20th century. And they said, this rise in ocean temperature is why we're seeing a increase in the frequency and severity of hurricanes. And it's also cause of the weather phenomena like the heat domes that was currently experienced in the West Coast. So, this thing is we keep hearing these scientists, these experts talk about it. We know that there's more heat being trapped in. Not sure where to go, what happens, but within this 20-year period, we've doubled what we're supposed to, or how quickly the Earth is supposed to heat up. So I don't know. I just wanted to mention that. It's not my wheelhouse, but it did catch my eye, and I felt like I should share that with folks.
Yeah, it's scary to see how quickly these changes are happening and the ways that they are impacting us in terms of natural disasters. I'm afraid of what we'll be seeing in the years to come in terms of, especially these states where, hurricanes and et cetera, where they do happen, we'll see more need for relief for those places.
It also has me thinking too a lot in the back of my mind, like, where would I want to settle down, like long term? And I kind of think about these kind of things, like, if we're going to start seeing more hurricanes, especially on the coastal and near the waters, because everything's getting warm, maybe moving more inland in the States would be more beneficial, more safe for long-term things if this is what's happening with these natural disasters. Because, hurricanes usually don't get to the center of the U.S., but of course there's not that many places that I want to be living out there. But, these things in the back of my mind, looking at these weather changes and stuff like that is like, like a place like Florida definitely would be a no-go. And we've seen places like Texas also see an uptick in hurricanes and things of that nature, in the West Coast with these massive heat waves and heat domes. So it's like, not many places to escape from, but it is something to consider now when you're trying to like figure out a place long term.
You can always move back to West Lafayette.
see. Oh man, that's probably one of the last places on my radar. Find me out there in Idaho or something, like, before I give a chance. We'll see. But yeah, just want to throw that out there. And my final story just has to do with Lin-Manuel Miranda catching some fire this past week as well. He is the person who wrote Hamilton, for those who don't know. The play before Hamilton was Washington Heights. And so they recently made a film about that I believe is on HBO Max right now in theaters, something like that. And he was just called out because there were activists and just people in general who said that there was an extreme lack of dark-skinned Afro-Latinx actors in the movie, which does not represent the real-life Washington Heights community, because there is a lot of browner Afro-Latinx folks in that area. And so, he came out and apologized for it and said he should have been more thoughtful in that casting, but was not. So this is something that piqued my interest, because it's also somebody who was from that community, who is also Latinx, but still missed the mark as far as getting proper representation for folks in that community.
Yeah. It's interesting because my good friend from college, she doesn't live there anymore, but she lived there for years, and I would visit her frequently. And yes, it's such a diversity in, appearance. And, she was Black. She's not Latinx, but she, is Black from, a Caribbean country. And I think this film and the casting is a reflection of Hollywood in general, whether it's the Latinx community or the Black community. It just seems to be that when it comes to casting, colorism is a potential issue. So yeah, it's just considering, the reception to Hamilton and what people probably, kind of thought of him as like woke. I'm assuming that they figured that he would have been more attentive to this type of issue from the beginning, but we all have blind spots.
Yep. I think that's part of the issue. Yeah, we just probably expect, because Hamilton was a very diverse cast, folks of all different kind of backgrounds, and so you think that would translate over. And I feel like it's probably even a little bit more important, because this is a film that a lot more people are going to see, and so you're going to want them to know what it actually looks like if they were to visit Washington Heights, and not just think it would be a lot of all fair-skinned Latinx folks, right? So that's why representation matters, because now there's a huge population of that community that's not being represented, and now millions of people are going to see this film, and that's going to be their takeaway of what that area looks like. So he apologized for it, and I'm sure he'll be very conscious on any other upcoming projects, and so other people. But again, just because you are a Black or brown person, sometimes, like Daph said, you may have blind spots. And so this is why it's good to have a diverse team, because I'm sure maybe if you had, I don't know what the team was, but some maybe folks from the community or casting in particular, I feel like folks have to really have somebody that's sensitive or conscious of these things. If you're like a casting director, you're the ones that are sifting and filtering through this list. But if you're conscious of those kind of things, you won't have it. So maybe that could be a better step. But also the director, whoever's written it, should be conscious of that too. So. All righty. So that covers Oh Lord News. Today, our special guest joining us is Dr. Fernando Tormos-Aponte, an assistant professor at the University of Maryland County and a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University. And he's here today to talk to us about, social movements, Black Lives Matter, the social movements in Puerto Rico, etc. He's also a colleague of ours and friend from Purdue. We were all there together as well. He was in the political science department. And so definitely we had a lot of overlap with him there and conversations with him on campus as well. So it's good to catch up and see all the wonderful work he's doing currently.
Absolutely. It's always great when we have these Purdue reunions to see how well everyone is doing. Fernando's scholarship is fire. The conversation was amazing. I love, the ways that we were not only able to focus on like Black Lives Matter, but also think about it in a different context or different U.S. context, and that is Puerto Rico. So just a really, really great conversation. We discussed internal divisions within social movements, as well as, social media, the digital age, and how that's impacting things. So overall, great conversation.
For sure. So without further ado, we will get Fernando on and then we will catch up with y'all afterwards. For today's episode, we welcome Dr. Fernando Tormos-Aponte, an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University. During the interview, we discuss his research on social movements, including how they cope with internal divisions and gain political influence. We also have a conversation about the role of social media in movement building, social movements in Puerto Rico, and the Black Lives Matter movement. Welcome, Dr. Tormos-Aponte.
Hey, thank you so much for this invitation. It's going great. I'm really happy to get to talk to you all again.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you on, man. It's been a while, but we've all been keeping track of each other via social media and seeing all the wonderful things that you've been doing and other folks that we went to graduate school with as well. So it's good to catch up.
Yes, amazing things.
So what we like to do for our first question, we just like to ask our guests, introduce yourselves to our audience and tell our audience a little bit about who you are.
Definitely. So I guess you got my academic background. My less academic background, I guess, is that I'm originally from Puerto Rico, where I was born and raised, and it was there that I became politicized and developed an interest and passion for the study and practice of politics and social movement work. And I decided that I wanted to pursue a career in the study of activism and social movements and the impacts that this kind of work has on public policy and politics. And that's why I moved to the continental United States in 2011, and I did a PhD at Purdue University. I had the pleasure of meeting you all there and other great folks over there. And I went on to do a postdoc in St. Louis, where I studied some of the grassroots activism that took place in Ferguson after the killing of Mike Brown. And I recently moved to Baltimore, where I'm continuing that kind of work. And I recently joined the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And in Baltimore, I'm excited to expand on the previous work on Black Lives Matter activism, as well as other work that I do around issues of environmental justice, labor movement, climate justice, energy justice, some work on intersectionality and what that means for social movements, and a lot of work on Puerto Rico, most of it inspired by the recent events that took place after Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the uprising in 2019 that was successful at getting the governor at the time to resign.
So, your at the end of your response, you kind of got into what I wanted know a little bit more about, kind of like events or experiences that really sparked your, scholar activism. Because one thing that I really noticed about you not only study this topic, but you have been very involved in like unionizing and et cetera. And so, in addition to some of the, political circumstances that you mentioned, like, after the hurricane, are there any other like experiences or, political events that really kind of shaped your identity as both a scholar and an activist?
Yes, absolutely. And there are many, of course, because this kind of political formation is something that evolves over one's lifetime. But, I had the privilege of seeing the beauty of nature in my homeland of Puerto Rico. And when you get to observe and appreciate nature, you develop this sort of love for it, and also a sense of connection to it. And over the course of my teenage years, I became aware of different ways in which our governments and corporations were enacting public policies that were really damaging to the environment. And also the U.S. military, and particularly the U.S. Navy, was bombing the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. It's an island municipality off the east coast of Puerto Rico. And there was a massive movement in Puerto Rico around the use of the island of Vieques for military exercises. So that gave me a lot of critical perspective around the U.S. military, the U.S. government, and it actually made me shift my views. I went from being someone who thought that Puerto Rico would be better off as a state of the United States to being someone who thought that it was actually better to separate Puerto Rico from the United States. And I became pro-independence, and that took me into all kinds of other directions where I really learned like that there was a global movement against imperialism, militarism. So, I became involved in those movements. And when I was in the University of Puerto Rico, a lot of friends of mine became very involved in the student movement. And they were like, they always criticized me because I was theory. I was super into the books, into the theory. But they were like, you're always in the theory. What about the action? Like you need to enact the theory, right? Like the theory can't just be theory. And it took me a while. And honestly, my friends basically just shamed me into becoming politically active. And I just never went back. I became very, very deeply involved in life-altering ways in the Puerto Rican student movement. And it was there where I started asking myself more like strategic questions of, so what do we know about what makes movements politically impactful? Like, how do we win? And I wanted to learn more from both a practical but also an intellectual standpoint. How do we win? How do we achieve social change and social justice? And that's how I got into academia. So it wasn't the other way around, where my studies took me to activism. Actually, my activism that motivated my study.
Thank you for sharing that. We want to get into some of the specifics of your research and some specific social movements. But before we get to that, we think it's important just to define some concepts for our listeners. And I think the main one I'd like you to take a shot at defining is social movement. Kind of, how would you define a social movement for our listeners so that we're all on the same page?
So I should start by saying that there is debate around the definition of social movement. And we should be comfortable with these debates, right? We should entertain these debates because defining concepts is an important thing that we do in our intellectual work. But generally, there are a series of traits that around which there is some scholarly agreement about what is a social movement, and they are the following. There's some agreement around the notion that movements are collective bodies, collective phenomena, right? So movements are not just one person or one hashtag, but rather movements consist of collectives of people and social groups, organizations that mobilize others and engage in collective action. So they're collective. Movements also take place over time. So movements are not just one thing that happens one day or 1 week. There's an element of continuity over time, temporal continuity. So they're collective bodies that engage in collective action over periods of time. And a third aspect of movements is that they make claims, they make demands, they ask different actors like governments or corporations to change the way they do things or to keep something that they're doing the same way, right? So they're claims-making bodies. And generally, those are three basic traits that we use to distinguish movements from other kinds of social phenomena. Like, for instance, sometimes folks confuse a protest with a movement. And protest is a tactic that movements can use, and it takes place, and it's a tactic that movements use. But one protest is not necessarily a movement. Consider something a movement. It has to be collective. It has to take place over a period of time, and it has to make demands. So nonprofits, for instance, if they're not making political demands, we wouldn't necessarily consider them social movement organizations. Another thing that sometimes gets confused with movements is immigration and the movement of people. That is also something that, unless folks are making political demands and claims, and there are, of course, immigrant movements, but otherwise we wouldn't consider them movements per se.
That's really important distinctions that you kind of make. And you mentioned hashtag, and it seems like you're, making a distinction between tactic and movement, idea and movement. And so it just made me think like, is social media essential to like creating a movement in the digital age? And how do you go from like hashtag/idea to influential movement? Like, are there different phases?
Absolutely. And, social media is definitely a catalyst for social movement activity and mobilization. But a lot of folks would caution against an over-reliance on social media, because social media is not a substitute for the kind of work that goes into preparing people to engage in collective action and in activism, right? So even though we can use social media to contact folks, to prepare them, to let them know that there will be an event, that there will be a training, there is work that goes into producing that kind of work, producing that kind of information, mobilizing people, bringing them into particular areas, events, right? So, or campaigns. So some folks, of course, would caution against an over-reliance on social media. And, some might even say that in these times, social media is necessary for social movement success, but it's not sufficient, right? You still need to do the groundwork of mobilizing people. But social media is incredibly important in our times. So, we've seen that social media has allowed movements to reach folks who would have otherwise not known about particular movement events. And this is one of the reasons why we are observing a surge in the amount of people that report engaging in social movement activities like protests, demonstrations, visuals, and other kinds of collective action. So social media has enabled, in great measure, a lot of social movement activity. So to give you an example, around the Arab Spring, a lot of folks credited social media for the Arab Spring, right? We saw images of a merchant lighting himself on fire in Tunisia because of the cost of living, and all of a sudden this image spread across a lot of different states in the Middle East and North Africa, and we started seeing major uprisings. But a lot of scholars were saying, social movement scholars among others were saying, well, you had social media in every country, but you didn't have an uprising in every country. What was the difference, right? Why did we have uprisings in some countries and not in others? Well, in the case of Egypt, for instance, Philip Marsley wrote a wonderful book about the uprising in Egypt. He argued that there were a number of factors that enabled an uprising in Egypt, one of which was that Egypt had a labor movement that was very much involved and in favor of the uprising, and that helped mobilize large numbers of people. There was also a growing women's movement that took the streets in Egypt, and these things coalesced And of course, social media was a catalyst and enabled this kind of the magnitude of the movement. But in the absence of the kind of organization, what some scholars called organizational infrastructures or mobilization, you may not have observed an uprising in a highly repressed state such as Egypt.
No, thanks for that. That helps really break it down. I'm sure our listeners have a little more clearer understanding of it. You know, and when looking at your research interest and some of your write-ups, you know, one of the aspects you mentioned that piqued my attention is your research focused on social movements, how social movements cope with internal divisions. So what do you mean? What do you mean by that, and kind of what does that look like?
So one of the things that got that made me interested in this question of internal divisions within movements was something that I observed and that others had observed before me, and it's the fact that a lot of movements emerge. And for the longest time, we were really interested in trying to understand, why do movements emerge? Why do movements emerge? And then folks started shifting their focus to the question of, how do movements survive? Because even though we were starting to see more and more social movements emerging, particularly, we started seeing a boom in movement and the founding of new movement organizations in the 70s, 80s, 90s, particularly around questions of global justice and globalization, new trade agreements like NAFTA, the creation of the World Trade Organization. These things ignited the creation of new organizations and new movements, but we were also witnessing that movements had a really tough time surviving. And, you know, you can have an important victory, a social movement victory at one period in time, but victories need to be defended. Victories are never perennial victories. When you don't win something at one point in time and you secure those rights that you won over for the rest of time. I mean, I think that the case of the Voting Rights Act is a perfect example of that, right? You have a bit of avoid racial gerrymandering that we thought we had won back in the civil rights era, and that's my only thing that matters for the survival of social movements. You know, resources matter, organizations matter, leadership matters, innovation, tactical innovation matters, the conditions, the context in which they organize, all these things matter. So I had the pleasure of having a great conversation with a famous sociologist, Patricia Hill Collins, who told me, why do you keep saying overcome? You know, movements don't just overcome divisions. Divisions are always there. The question is, can they cope with them? And I think that there are ways of coping with them. So, you know, one way is to try to avoid this practice of silencing internal dissent, right? And this is something that I've really adopted from the work of my old dissertation advisor, Laurel Weldon, who identified these norms of inclusion and solidarity and then the movement against gender-based violence globally. And they managed to sustain their activism and get major victories like the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination and Violence Against Women, CEDAW, in part because they adopted these norms of inclusion.
So one thing I was wondering is, you know, beyond potential like internal divisions, are there any other, you know, factors or issues that might potentially shape and or stifle social movements?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the main contributions to this literature, one of the most important, in my opinion, has been the work of Christian Davenport, who has really defied this phenomenon or has examined empirically this phenomenon of what folks call protesting while black, which is the notion that, you know, black groups tend to be policed and repressed at greater rates than white groups, right? So
he's brought a lot of attention to the repression against minority groups in the United States and the importance of dealing with this repression in order to survive over time and to exert political influence. So repression is definitely something that can obstruct a movement's ability to survive and to exert political influence. A lack of resources is also something that can be really challenging. And before I go on, I should say that even in highly repressive contexts, however, movements have managed to persist, right? I mean, the work of one of our former professors, Rachel Einwohner, has been really interesting in this regard, where, she asked herself, how during the Holocaust, how did we observe the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, right? Like, this is one of the most repressive contexts that you can ever think of, and yet you still saw folks out there and risking their lives. And she argued that part of this was the search for honor and dignity. And there are certain values that movements can hold dearly and close to their hearts that can allow them to cope with these contexts that can stifle their ability to succeed, like repression or resource scarcity or conflict.
Good, thank you. I think all those can definitely take part in kind of stifling or sometimes shaping a movement or regressing it from repressing it in some different ways. Earlier, and this is for our listeners too, I know you mentioned social movements in Puerto Rico, and you mentioned 2019 uprising, stuff like that, which I believe has to do around a governor's actions and things of that nature and politicians. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what transpired there and how and why that's important?
Absolutely. And I've written a number of pieces around this. So there's so much I can go into, but I'll try to get the very brief sort of digest. It's essentially Puerto Rico has been under the rule of an unelected fiscal control board because of its inability to pay its massive debt, which is more than $70 billion. And local governments and local political parties, which have traded the executive power over the executive branch, have sort of debated on how to interact with this fiscal control board. But ultimately, one thing has won, and it has been fiscal austerity. So Puerto Rico has had to dismantle a lot of its social welfare institutions and services. So this includes hospital closures. This includes neglecting the electric grid, and neglecting the educational system, closing schools. So what happened in 2019 took place in this context of increasing austerity, inequality, rising unemployment, and outward migration. It also took place in the wake of the 2017 Hurricane Maria, which completely devastated Puerto Rico. During that time, the governor, Ricardo Rosselló, from the pro-statehood party, the Partido Nuevo Progresista, he denied, alongside Donald Trump, during Donald Trump's visit, which he rolled out the red carpet for, he denied that Puerto Rico had suffered massive casualties due to this event. And that was something that was already simmering in the minds of people. People were very upset about this denial of the death of their relatives. So there was this sort of sense of indignation and rage that was there already, and a long-standing disdain for the two parties that had traded power in Puerto Rico. So this was generally the context. But what really sort of ignited the wave that we saw in 2019 was that the governor had a private chat on an app called Telegram with a number of his members of his cabinet. And this chat was leaked. And the leaked chat revealed some of the unscrupulous dealings of his inner circle, and just really disgusting ways in which they characterized even some of their own political allies. These folks insulted every person you can think of. They used every kind of trope you can think of. They even made fun of the dead after Hurricane Maria. They had homophobic jokes, fatphobic jokes, even against their own allies, even worse for their rivals. It revealed that they thwarted investigations. They colluded with the Fiscal Control Board on different aspects of their dealings. They even obstructed Obama-era civil rights investigation of the police department in Puerto Rico, which was under a consent decree. They obstructed that investigation and the ultimate reform that the Department of Justice had mandated. I mean, it revealed a series of corrupt dealings, and this happened on the same week as his former Secretary of Education was indicted for corruption, as well as his Secretary of the Treasury had gone on to a local radio station, and denounced the existence of a local elite mafia that essentially ruled the Ricky Rosselló government. So, were very, very upset, and they started protesting in front of the governor's mansion. Well, at first it was just only 50 people. The numbers are, of course, a matter of debate, and people get involved. I don't think it is as important as the people who showed up. We're talking about folks who had never protests ever in their lives. We're talking about people from all over the Puerto Rican archipelago, right? Puerto Rico is a series of islands. People traveled. People took buses to get to the governor's mansion, and they were heavily, heavily repressed. And one of the things that I described in one of my articles that I published in the socialist magazine Jacobin is that there was one night where there were more than 100,000 in Old San Juan. Old San Juan is where the governor's mansion is. It's like an islet, right? It's connected by bridges. So there are a few access points into this really small little island. The police was closing access to Old San Juan, and all the while folks are retreating because they are under heavy, heavy repression. There was this major mobilization of motorcycle drivers who there was this guy who used to organize these major rides, and these are people coming out of the different in Puerto Rico, poor, predominantly black neighborhoods in Puerto Rico, the projects in Puerto Rico, and he was going project by project, neighborhood by neighborhood, gathering hundreds and hundreds until they became more than 1,000 motorists, all in motorcycles, making their way to Old San Juan. And I believe this night was a turning point in that whole campaign to get the governor to resign, because as folks were retreating, we then witnessed this major wave of motorcycles who were experts at evading police. So they managed to make their way into the island of Old San Juan, and all of a sudden protesters turned back and they went back to the governor's mansion. And I think that evening, I think the governor realized that there was support for his resignation from multiple sectors of society, and that they could no longer say that this was just a group of a far leftist extremists, or as they call them, the bearded and hairy socialists from the University of Puerto Rico. So the governor ended up resigning, only to very recently be elected to be a shadow representative in the search for statehood in the U.S. Congress, which has, of course, garnered a lot of opposition in Puerto Rico from the very people who ousted him when he was governor.
Wow. It's really interesting to get that insight and even to see kind of the outcome of some of these efforts to create change. Although, as you just noted, things can get complicated in terms of like the actual outcomes of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
One other area that you mentioned earlier in terms of your research is the Black Lives Matter movement. And, I'd really be interested in knowing some of your takeaways from your research on this particular movement.
Absolutely. And, interestingly, one of the things that motivated me to study Black Lives Matter and the movement itself was that I felt a sense of connection between the activism that takes place in Puerto Rico and the activism that is now front and center around matters of racial justice, as we now know it as Black Lives Matter. This question of American democracy. So one of the things that I was frustrated about when I read scholarly opinions about the Black Lives Matter movement and about the Donald Trump administration was that, all of a sudden when Trump got elected, we now feared for the demise of democracy. But I mean, where was this kind of outrage, this kind of concern when folks in Black and brown neighborhoods and territories and reservations of the United States never got access to that democracy that they love to profess throughout the world? And only now we were outraged about the threats to democracy. Only now democracy was under threat. And my project on Black Lives Matter is essentially a critique of this notion that, there ever was democracy in the United States. Democracy for whom? Right? And that's why I've titled some of the manuscripts, "For Whom Does Democracy Work?" And it's a critique of the notion that, the key to the health of American democracy resides in what some sociologists and political scientists have called social capital. And we only find that in parent and teacher conferences and in neighborhood potlucks in white neighborhoods. Well, what about the democracy that is taking place from below in Black and brown neighborhoods? That kind of democracy should also matter. And the extent to which democracy and it does not exist in these neighborhoods should also be a cause for concern. So this project is interested in understanding this sort of hypocrisy, right? This sort of inconsistency in the discourse that folks have forwarded around the key to the revitalization of democracy, and it tries to bring light to the fact that what they're really talking about is white democracy of a settler colonial state, and that the Black Lives Matter movement, the Puerto Rico independence movement, the movements against pipelines and for climate and environmental justice in the United States, they're trying to build a different kind of democracy that doesn't only take place under the name and institutions of the United States. This is a democracy that is emerging from below and is one that I'm very excited about. So I'm trying to observe this democracy, and I'm making the argument that one of the reasons for why it's emerging, for why it's working, for why it's breathing energy into our own movements, but other movements as well, is because it's adopted an intersectional solidarity organizing approach. It's an approach that builds on the power that resides amongst folks who come from marginalized backgrounds, and specifically from intersectionally marginalized backgrounds. So this is a movement that is under the leadership of queer Black women, of trans folks. And I think this is something that has lent this movement a great deal of strength, and that it is a model for building movements moving forward and across different spaces.
No, I think, that's really interesting. And, this question comes to mind because I do a lot of group work in Newark with guys who are in and out the system. And sometimes we discuss Black Lives Matter and, their critique of it, and these are predominantly Black men, they always say that they feel like the movement isn't a real movement because there is not one kind of figure or two figures, like traditional leadership. We've seen Malcolm X, Martin, whoever. They're, really their point of reference is really what they've seen a lot in the civil rights. So how would you respond to that if they were to bring that kind of critique up in front of you about the Black Lives Matter and they're not having like that one or two essential faces that we typically see in the past with other movements?
I think this is a very legitimate point. And there's problematic leaders being paraded in front of us right now as the faces of any particular movement, right? So it does not mean that the movement is absent of leadership. In fact, one of the reasons for why I think that this movement has grown in its reach and its magnitude has been because of the leadership that we find. And some of the leaders of the movement have described it as a leaderful movement. And, these are folks who unfortunately are not currently, household names. But I think of the work of people like Kayla Reed in Ferguson and in St. Louis, Missouri, who have recently elected Cori Bush to Congress, who has become an outspoken supporter and leader in the Black and the communities of color. Right? They've recently elected Tashara Jones as the new mayor, who has committed to closing the workhouse jail, a terrible jail in St. Louis. They have gotten the Board of Aldermen to defund the workhouse jail. They're getting commitments to invest in the community and divest from the things that harm it. Right? So this is a leader that should be a household name, Kayla Reed, but it's currently not. And sometimes I feel like we have failed to elevate the names that should be household names. And I shouldn't just say we. I mean, there are reasons for why these folks are not recognized as the leaders that they are, but they are becoming more and more recognized. So, for instance, Kayla Reed and her colleague, Blake Schroeder, I believe Schroeder is his last name, they just published a great column on how to turn protest into power in the New York Times as part of a series on the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. So, they are starting to get that recognition. Derica Purnell. There's so many leaders, Melina Abdullah. There's so many folks that we can point to as leaders, but this is a leaderful movement, and there's reason to be hopeful for a movement that does not solely rely on one or two or three charismatic leaders. And I take a lot of inspiration from the work of scholars like Aldo Morris, Marshall Gans, Hari Hahn, and others who have argued that, movements who invest in leadership and horizontal forms of leadership are more likely to survive and be politically impactful. And that leadership is really one of the reasons, in the case of Aldo Morris, for why the civil rights movement was impactful. But he wasn't just talking about Martin Luther King Jr. He was talking about the leadership on the ground in Black churches and Black communities. That's the kind of leadership that Morris was referring to. And Gans was referring to the leadership that, folks like Cesar Chavez built and Dolores Huerta built amongst the UFW and different unions of farm workers. They build leadership from the bottom up, diverse leadership, inclusive leadership.
No, thank you for that. I think that's helpful. We're about to wrap up in a little bit, but I did have one more topic I just wanted to pick your brain on a little bit, and that's recently with a lot of the conversations going on with the hashtag Stop Asian Hate, and we've seen them push for political action, and we've seen all the way up to the president's office signing certain bills as a reflection of that. And then yet I've seen other conversations on the other side too, saying, hey, black people, brown people have been asking for a lot of things as well, and we haven't seen that kind of quick action. So I don't know, have you been following this? What are your thoughts on this particular moment with Stop Asian Hate, hashtag Stop Asian Hate?
I mean, I think this is an important moment to continue to build on a tradition of Black and Asian and Latino, Latinx, Puerto Rican, and indigenous solidarity, right? To the extent that we elevate the issues of any of these groups, I think other groups will benefit as well. And I find a lot of inspiration in the words of the authors of the Combahee River Collective Statement, who, made the argument that, until Black women are free, no one is free, right? It takes freeing all these groups for all of us to experience freedom, right? So we're really trying to, I think that we should continue to move in the direction of avoiding oppression Olympics, which is something that intersectionality scholars like Anne-Marie Hancock and others have brought a lot of attention to. That won't forward our collective struggles, and that insofar as we can continue to build solidarities across our struggles, and we can continue to build on the traditions of solidarity, right? This solidarity doesn't happen in a vacuum. And avoid discourses that pit us against each other. We can build collective strength, collective power to bring about changes that will help many of these groups, right? We are now in a moment where we are finally having broad discussions around reparations. And, we're having broad discussions about the theft of indigenous land. We're having broad discussions around discrimination, the impacts of colonialism. And that is because of the joint work that these different groups have done together. And that's where I see a lot of promise. So I'm actually very excited that there's more and more attention coming to the case of Asian hate, and I find a lot of inspiration in the work of my colleague Diane Wong, who's been doing some fantastic polling, and who finds that actually, Black and Asian youth share a lot of perspectives around the policing around the police state. Right? They're more likely to support defunding of the police, decarceration, closing jails. They are motivated for each other's causes. So we're actually, I think, closer in terms of our political alignment that people make us out to be.
I completely agree with you in terms of seeing where, these different movements that take into account the history and the experiences of all of these different groups who are oppressed in their own ways, and not thinking about it in terms of, who experiences more, but thinking about how we can all overcome and, work together in solidarity to overcome white supremacy. And those are conversations that I have definitely been in, around Black and Asian solidarity. I feel like there's always been, discussions about like Black and brown solidarity. So I definitely hope that we are moving in a good direction in terms of understanding that none of us will be free until all of us are free, like you just said.
Absolutely.
So, we asked you, a lot about your research and your take on different things, but, we always like to keep the floor open for you to share anything that we didn't ask about, if you have any research in the pipeline or anything else you'd like to share.
Oh, well, I have too much research in the pipeline. I'm trying to stay on top of it. But I just feel really fortunate that you all have invited me into this space. I really have a lot of respect and admiration for the work that both of you do, and I find a lot of inspiration in the work that you're doing and in the voices that you're elevating in this program. And I know that there's a lot of labor that goes into this, but ultimately, I think that we're trying to build a different way of being within the academic spaces, and in ways that we remain connected to our causes and the things that we know are affecting the folks who we identify with. And I would like to encourage folks to avoid separating, theory from action, scholarly work with activism, and I encourage folks to seek opportunities for becoming politically engaged, and not just within our own workplace context like universities, but also well beyond it, and to break out of those spaces. There are fantastic organizations out there that people can become active with, like Scholars for Social Justice is one that I've just recently become more involved in, and I'm really excited about that. We're just rolling out an abolition campaign during the month of May, and I'm also excited about the fact that we're growing, we're hiring staffers, we're hiring organizers. So if anyone out there is trying to get a job as an organizer, get in touch with us. We're trying to hire folks to help us grow the Scholars for Social Justice organization, and take a look at the website. I mean, the folks that we're working with are just, some of our leaders and inspirations in our circles that are seeking social justice. So you check out that organization. Who might be more STEM focused, you might want to check out the Science Network that is organized by the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm also very active there as well. And there are just many, many other organizations to choose from. Organize within your associations, within your scientific societies. There are opportunities to mobilize there as well. So, as always, please feel free to contact me. My email is ft@umbc.edu. I'd be happy to share information about any of these organizations or campaigns with folks that might be interested.
Great. And what's your social media as well? Drop that.
I'm at Fernando Tormos, and I'm on Twitter, and I just recently got Instagram, so I'm new to the platform.
Nice. So we'll be sure to attach those links and, of course, your social media and email to the description of this episode, so that way folks can just easily click on that and find out all the work you're doing, organizations you're part of, and also just connect with you on social media or via email if necessary. So, Fernando, we appreciate all the work you're doing. We appreciate you taking the time to come chat with us about all of this great work. And like always, we're always going to, stay in touch and watch what you're doing. And if we ever can be of assistance to you or use of this platform, just let us know, man. We're all in this fight together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this invitation. So much love and respect for what you do. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, man. Have a good one. Yo, Dad, so what you think about old homie Fernando coming to come chat with us today about all his work he's doing, especially with social movements, which is very, very relevant in today's time. Always relevant, but even more particularly today.
When I just think about, because, I follow Fernando on social media, and I just think about the ways in which he integrates his activism into his scholarship and his scholarship into his activism. And he mentioned in our interview how he doesn't separate these. He encourages, scholars, in quotes, to not feel like they have to have this like two-ness about themselves. And I really feel like he exemplifies that. He, has been a past MDP, and I hope our audience understands just why he earned that title.
Oh yeah, for sure. Right. You should easily see that. And this is inspiring in the sense that I'm hopeful, because we know we have a lot of gripes with academia, but I feel like this next generation, us, these millennials who begin to take ranks and get tenure and get in positions of power, I feel like we're going to change the system in a little bit, because I just feel like there's a larger numbers than probably in the past that like to have that combination of theory and practice, right? And our work meaning something and affecting the communities that we research, that we service, or whatever it is. And so, having people like Fernando on really speaks to that. That it's just not because, me and you, we talk about this all the time. We have other scholars that have talked about it a lot. And so when we hear this and see this, it just gives me hope for the future that, hopefully academia will now officially become that bridge, right, to the community and keep it going to make some real change happen and make the lives better of folks all around.
Absolutely agree. Another kind of theme from the interview that I feel has been, really dominant in my life over this past semester has been, the topic of, Asian activism, like Stop Asian Hate, and like solidarity between communities of color. I had the privilege to learn from some of the Asian American students who were in my class about race. And although the class focused primarily on or exclusively on African Americans and our history of inequality in the United States, the projects for the class allowed students to explore what was on their heart. And quite a few students looked at like the history of Asian American hate in this country. And I have been so lucky to like learn from them and think about how I can incorporate that into my scholarship, into my teaching, and into my activism.
Oh yeah. All of that's important, right? Kind of what he was mentioning in closing when we talked about Stop Asian Hate campaign is that we're all in this together. It's a collective struggle, really, like you mentioned too, against white supremacy. And the more people we have on board against this, the better outcomes we'll see. And so, yeah, I'm in agreement that we should join hands. We should fight this fight together. And it's good to see when other groups are making strides that it hopefully will impact and affect all of us who are fighting that same fight. I also appreciated his discussion on what has been going on in Puerto Rico with the governors and the politicians there. I mean, that sounded real crazy. The corruption, all from the chat and the emails and the communications they had of just everything they were saying. But the fact that people fought back against this and got them out of there is important to show, again, this can happen. When folks do rise and come together, we can get what we want. And this is also interesting too, because even though we didn't get too deep into it, the nuances, right, of we talked about before of DC potentially becoming a state and then folks advocating for Puerto Rico to become a state as well. But Fernando had reservations about that too, right? So it's good to have these kind of conversations too, where he was more promoting independence. And, we need to have more conversations about that instead of just assuming that this is what folks and everyone in Puerto Rico wants and is for the best of that community. This is why it's good to have many different voices and experiences on to share and shed light to have us think about differently so we can advocate accurately in these manners as well.
Absolutely. I think, exactly what you, just spoke about. I learned so much from this interview in the same way that I mentioned learning from my students. And I think it just highlights the importance of having, these conversations across difference to learn. I feel like we just have to increasingly move into a space where we are willing to be learners and learners of other cultures to see, because, one thing that he mentioned is how, different, movements that he's been a part of or that he's seen how they have been influenced, by, Black American struggles. And that is one thing that I have noticed. There are a lot of people who study the history, of Black American activism and incorporate that into their own. And it's like, what can we learn from the tactics and the struggles from other communities to see how we can improve what we're doing?
Oh, 100%. And we've seen other countries learn from our oppressors and take their strategies to oppress their own as well. And then how people fight back. So yeah, that the global struggle is real. And it's good that in this digital age, it's easy for us to become more aware of what's going on across the land, across the waters, etc., so that we all can fight and combat this together. So I definitely did think that, this generation and beyond, we're moving in the right direction, and we hopefully continue to see some changes. Like we all say, just want to make the world a better place than when you left it, right? When you leave. So that's the goal I think we're all are pushing for. So yeah, we appreciate Fernando coming to talk to us about his work. We have all his links included to the description, so please check them out. He has some public writings as well, not all just kind of academic scholarship, which is really, really good. And then follow him on social media. After you do that, follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. @BHD Podcast is our social media handle across all platforms. You can visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to keep up with all our latest content. You can email us, bhdpodcast@gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, guest ideas, whatever it is, hit us up. We love to hear from you all. Even if you just want to say hello, we appreciate that too. And then if you can, review and rate us on iTunes. That really helps us out with the algorithms. So please take a moment to do that. It helps more people find this platform and help raise the voices of a lot of folks who may not be heard as much. We talk about scholars of color and people in the community. So please just drop a nice review and a rating, and that'll help more people get exposed to this platform. And after you do that, share us with your friends, share us with your family, share us with your enemies. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook @BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.